Hi everyone, welcome to day 2 for AMT. Sadly, this is the last day. Thank you to all the presenters and the chairs for the great presentations that we had yesterday, really thought-provoking. I first wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners and the custodians of the land, which we are all meeting on remotely today for this conference and also for yesterday. To start today's proceedings, we have a keynote speaker, Kyle Barnett, who is an associate professor of media studies in the Department of Communications at Bellarmine. I think I pronounced that incorrectly, but Bellarmine University. His research focuses on media history, media industries, popular music, and sound across media. He's published in the Journal of Popular Music Studies, Sound and the Moving Image, the Journal of Material Culture, and several books. He's the author of Record Cultures, The Transformation of the US Recording Industry. He's coming all the way from the US for us today, so thank you, Kyle.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks to Asha and Daisy and all the planners and everyone who's been working so hard on the conference. I would love to be in Melbourne with you, but my Louisville, Kentucky basement here in the United States is going to have to do. This conference's focus is really welcome and long overdue for me. The framework addresses some longstanding problems both in media studies and cultural studies. In fact, the very earliest readings I did in both, one of the first things that came to mind was a lack of attention to the regional and the rural. So this has been sort of lurking in the background of some of my work over time, and but this is the first time I've really been able to sort of address it in some kind of broader way. So I'm excited about that. Let me bring up my screen here. Let's see. How are we doing now? Can
Yep,
you see
that's
that?
perfect.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you. Great. Um, so, as I said, I've been thinking about this lack of attention to rural and regional media and culture for a long while, and thinking about how these areas are either poorly defined or they're used for ideological ends, both in media and in just sort of everyday life. And so, what I want to do this morning is to present a case study of a little known but very important record label called Jeanette Records, which I'm going to be spending most of my time on. But I'll give you just a brief sort of some thoughts about conceptual and methodological frameworks, and then talking a bit about regionalism and ideology, and being here in the U.S., thinking about the Great Lakes Midwest, where so much of early recording industry history takes place, thinking about it as constructed as such, and then as a heartland. And then at the very end, I'll talk a little bit about sort of legacies, rediscoveries, and ongoing dynamics. So the book that I wrote in a sort of a amazingly bad timing, I published the book 2 weeks before stay-at-home protocols began in the United States. And so I've been doing all my presentations this way. Thinking about Jeanette Records, I want to sort of set you up here to think about the part of the country that I'm maybe 5 minutes south of at present, and to talk to you about what the implications of this work was. So Jeanette Records, it looks like Gannett, it's pronounced Jeanette. It was a small town US record company that took on some of the biggest companies in the business in the 1920s, and they won. So I think it's really useful. We're thinking about media production, consumption, and distribution in sort of regional areas, rural areas. The Jeanette example, I think, is a nice it nicely upends a lot of assumptions that we commonly hold. So to give you a sense of where it's located, so Jeanette Records was located in Richmond, Indiana. So it's sort of right there along the Indiana-Ohio border. It's roughly an hour north of Cincinnati and an hour west of Indianapolis, and then several hours southeast of Chicago. So if any of those are familiar. So thinking about my work as a media studies scholar, the way in which I approach sound recordings is really looking at them as media. You know, often they can also be music, but thinking about sound recordings as media is pretty central to me. I'm always sort of pushing popular music studies to do its history. You know, often in popular music research, it's either contemporary or perhaps it'll go back a few decades, but we haven't really, I'm not sure we've really done the work. In my own media historiography, I have a pretty self-conscious approach, and I think I will explain that in part by showing what I've done. But thinking about where the gaps in research are and why and that sort of thing. Thinking too about media industries and the shifting networks, centers, and peripheries, which include regions of the United States that aren't commonly thought of, industry, film, television, radio, sound recording, and so forth. And then thinking along the lines some of the other presenters on the first day of the conference, thinking about inclusive and exclusive discourses, particularly around the notion of so-called heartland. Um, recorded sound, the way I think about it, really is one of the most important early emergent media of the late 19th and early 20th century. We tend to associate recorded sound with music, but we need to keep in mind it's only one such practice among others. You know, there's spoken word recordings and all sorts of different kinds of approaches that can be employed. I think because we associate music so much with live performance still, I think sometimes its role as media is obscured, even though we're much more likely to consume music as media than we are to experience it in a live performance. And then I'll be thinking a lot about sound recordings in relation to institutes, companies, and then peripherally sort of universities and archives. Speaking of archives, the work I'm presenting today would not be possible if I had relied on the archives that are commonly visited here in the United States. The Jeanette record label, there are very few holdings within sort of traditional archives. I think UCLA in Los Angeles has a collection of the recordings. UC Santa Barbara has a few. Now Indiana University at Bloomington has a pretty large collection, but they're really the exceptions. And almost all the paperwork I found related to the company comes from collectors and from less traditional sources, from county historical societies and local foundations. So all that leads me to this is I think it's important in archival research to really avoid path dependence. Looking in the unlikely places can pay off in unlikely ways. I gained a lot of respect for archivists and collectors during the course of this research. I spent a lot of time with both groups, and I've learned a lot from them. No archive has everything cataloged, so much of the knowledge that's housed in the place is in the head of archivists. So you really need to rely on them in a lot of ways. Similarly, collectors, I think, we owe a lot for just holding on to things and realizing their importance. And so I've benefited from them both. I've used cataloged materials. I've used uncatalogued or even unknown materials, and I'll circle back to that in a minute. I purposefully went to a lot of less visited repositories. So here on the right, I have a picture of the Library of Congress. It's Madison Building, which I visited several times. The New York Public Library's Performing Arts Collection, where I discovered an uncatalogued collection that they let me go through. I convinced them that it existed because I had heard about it from a collector. That was exciting. And then the bottom image is of the Jeanette Foundation, a small operation run out of the Chamber of Commerce in Richmond, Indiana, where I spent several days, 1 week, going through their file cabinets, and I benefited a great deal. So going to the big archives is always useful, but ending there may not be. So particularly if you're interested in the regional and the rural, the so-called peripheries, in certain ways. Thinking about the area of the country that I'm talking about here, it's known as the Great Lakes Midwest. So the tightest formation there is on the left, the American states of Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Michigan. A bit broader on the right, you see at the top the state of Minnesota, and then under that the state of Iowa. Usually the Great Lakes are defined against what are known as the Great Plains, immediately to the west, and that's sort of America's so-called breadbasket. Lots of agriculture. There's a lot of agricultural work in the Great Lakes Midwest as well, but it is also an area known for a lot of manufacturing and industry. Parts of the Great Lakes Midwest are associated with what is known as the Rust Belt. So there's some very, very large cities and urban areas in this part of the country, and it's still really the center of population in the United States in a lot of ways. That population has shrunk as manufacturing has sort of moved on in different ways. This part of the country, I really leaned on Vicki Johnson's book, Heartland TV, to think about Heartland discourse and within the U.S. context, and to think about how the U.S. Midwest in general, and then the Great Lakes gets constructed as a kind of a heartland in different sorts of ways. The heartland metaphor plays out in a few different ways. On the one hand, Johnson says that the Midwest can serve as pure heartland that symbolizes an ideal for the rest of the nation. And it's sort of the most American of America, of all possible Americas. On the other hand, it can sometimes also be constructed as an object of derision, an outdated America, a backwards place, a reactionary, conservative place, or even a naive place. And so Johnson, I'll just briefly quote her here. She says, "The Midwest as heartland, with its attendant ascribed values, is a key prism through and against which, quote, common sense, unquote, ideals regarding citizenship, national identity, and cultural worth have been variously debated and understood in critical moments in television and broader U.S. social history." And obviously, although Johnson is focused on television, I'm a few technological innovations earlier, back through radio and sound recordings. So when we think about regional media and the emergence of national media, there's a series of discourses, I think, that are on parallel tracks, but they don't often speak to one another. So commonly, because I'm in media studies, the narrative is focused around the rise of broadcast radio in the United States, particularly the rise of network radio, coast-to-coast radio, and the National Broadcasting Corporation, NBC, and their national network. But if you go back earlier, I think in the 1890s, early 1900s, you'll see the emergence of national magazines, which I think there's a good case to be made that it's really the first national medium. And then in terms of sound recordings themselves, sound recordings, I think, in different ways, particularly spoken word recordings, had by that point addressed Americans as Americans, addressing the nation in a certain way. And so in the upper corner here is a Nations Forum record label. This was a spoken word record series where had different politicians and generals and speakers trying to convince the American people that getting into World War I was indeed a good idea. So I think there's a number of different ways we can think about this, or complicate this sort of move from regional to national media. So thinking about the emergence of the sort of the major labels in the American record industry in the 1920s, all three major record labels in the U.S. record industry were all in and around New York City. So Victor Records, based in Camden, New Jersey, across from Philadelphia. Columbia Records, based in Bridgeport, with offices in New York City. And then Edison Records in Orange, New Jersey. Jeanette Records was based, as I've said, in Richmond, Indiana. Its parent company was a company called Star Piano Company. So when the big three started selling phonographs to private homes, it was operations like Star Piano that made phonograph cabinets to store the phonographs and make them acceptable for U.S. Homes. So many of these Great Lakes Midwest companies went on to design their own phonographs and then eventually release their own sound recordings. So in Jeanette's case, it was Star Piano was the corporate parent. Paramount Records in Wisconsin, it was the Wisconsin Chair Company, and so forth. This is a look at the works there in Richmond, Indiana. On the right, you can see some retail locations. One of the benefits that Jeanette had is that its Star Piano Company had stored musical instruments across North and South America, across the Americas. And so this was, I think, a hugely important aspect of their distribution network. And I meant to say earlier that, of course, the Great Lakes Midwest, it's constructed as sort of the most American of Americas, but it has a rich tradition. Many waves of immigrant groups really defined the area. Even before the earliest, European settlers. You had these amazing societies, networks all throughout the Great Lakes Midwest. So there's this broader history that I think gets erased once we start thinking of it in pretty constricted ways, right? It's constructed racially and historically in really specific sorts of ways. So Jeanette Records decided in the late 19-teens to take on Victor Records, the most famous record label in the country, and it was a battle over format. So I won't go into the details here, but Victor and Columbia had a proprietary playback system. So if you had a Victor phonograph, you couldn't Jeanette Records. And so Jeanette, along with some other of the independent labels, sued, and eventually it went to the Supreme Court, and Jeanette won the Supreme Court case in 1922. And so this was huge, very, very important for the label and its business. And so they pretty quickly realized that they could not compete with what the big three companies were doing, Edison, Victor, and Columbia. And so they started to search for niche genres, or just niche audiences, really not even genres yet, trying to think about what they could record that the East Coast labels had missed. And so Jeanette recorded a huge swath of American culture. The photograph in the middle is American politician and author William Jennings Bryant reciting his Cross of Gold speech. Jeanette did physical fitness records. In the lower record label there in the corner is a recording of Hopi Indians at the Grand Canyon in the 1920s. So there was a really broad kind of agenda in terms of what they're recording. They did, all these are Jeanette-related labels. They did labels for discount chains, for Sears store, for different American stores. And they did advertising and sponsorships like this soda, an little-known American soda called Moxie. You can see the label there. But the first real niche that Jeanette was able to identify was jazz. And this was really powered by the Star Piano company location in the South Loop in Chicago, where out of which they were able to scout a lot of Chicago jazz bands, including King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band. You see a photo of King Oliver and his band here, including a young Louis Armstrong. So Louis Armstrong actually does his very first recordings at the Jeanette Studios in Richmond, Indiana. Some of the other jazz folks that recorded for Jeanette, Jelly Roll Morton and the New Orleans Rhythm Kings in an early integrated session. The Red Onion Jazz Babies, that's Armstrong and his wife, Lil Hardin Armstrong, with Sidney Bechet, Eva Taylor, Albert Hunter, Big Spiderback, King Oliver, Hoagie Carmichael, and others. I'm going to play just a brief bit of the Red Onion Jazz to give you a sense of what acoustic sound recording and hot jazz sounded like in the 1920s. Just you get the idea. Okay, Jeanette, in addition to their jazz recordings, would do personal recordings, and these are fascinating. So they would do records for artists that maybe weren't signed to the label, but that wanted to sell records at the shows. The record on the right was from a woman from the Indiana Avenue scene. That record is worth quite a lot now. She would sell those at her concerts. On the left is a promotional record for a line of bird products. It's a sound of bird calls and a violin accompaniment. And so they would make these personal recordings. And it would be churches and high schools, and it's a really fascinating mix of American vernacular sounds from the era. And it's really, I think, we're thinking in terms of getting a sense of the regional and the rural. These are, I think, very valuable in that regard. But along with that, in the personal recordings section of what Jeanette did, they also recorded 78 RPM discs by the Ku Klux Klan. So the Klan, the white supremacist group, the domestic terrorist group, as we would call them now, were attempting to go mainstream in the 1920s. They were looking for mainstream viability and political power. They marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. It was a really terrifying time, a reaction to a lot of new freedoms and changing nature of the United States in the 20s. And while Jeanette didn't release any of these officially, they did take money from the organization and print these up. At least some employees of the company did so. And so I'm working on a separate essay about these right now. It's been floating around for many, many years, and I'm hoping to complete that soon. At the same time that they were releasing the so-called personal records from the Klan, they had also invested in an African-American owned record label out of Chicago known as Black Patty Records. Maybe some of you have heard of a record label called Black Swan. This is a famous 1920s effort from Harry Pace, another African-American, slightly earlier African-American label. But Black Patty was owned by J. Mayo Williams, who founded the Chicago Record Company and was an early record man / talent scout. And so record companies as cultural institutions are contradictory, sometimes maddeningly or troublingly so. But I think it's important to sort of think through the nature of these institutions in some sort of broader way. What I've painted for you here is this really broad kind of activity of the Jeanette label. Before it was all over, they were involved with 60 other record labels in the US and abroad. So this has really become an international operation. But of course, the emergent medium of the 1920s was radio. And so the phonograph was increasingly old hat by the late 1920s. It didn't sound especially good. The phonograph as a technology hadn't improved. It hadn't become electrified quite yet. It was still acoustic and mechanical. Record and film companies were converting to electrical recording and payback. That was quite expensive. Jeanette was able to do so. Not all of the smaller labels were able to do so. But so this transition to radio and then later the Great Depression really hurt labels like Jeanette. Within weeks of the stock market crash in the United States in 1929, Edison closed its shop completely. Victor had already been purchased by RCA, the Radio Corporation of America, and Columbia Records would eventually become part of CBS. So all the major record companies went out of business or they became subsidiaries to radio companies. This is almost never written about either in pop music histories or in radio histories. And I think it's important to point out. And so Jeanette was able to come up with one other sort of side business, and that was sound effects recordings, first for silent films, then for to use in talkies, and then to use on a live radio broadcast. So their sound effects thing lasted a bit longer than the rest of the operation. So by the 1930s, radio companies, and which became later television companies, or other bigger record companies, had taken over the industrial works of these earlier companies in the Great Lakes Midwest. So the photos I have here, the photo on the left is of the old Jeanette Records plant, which later was purchased by Decca. And by the time this photo was taken, there on the left, the black and white one, this is a Rca Records plant. The next two photographs, top to bottom, there is the Rca Records plant. So RCA buying up space in Indianapolis for their record business, and later they made video discs there. The next two to the right, the black and white one, and then the Sony DADC, that's Columbia Records and their Terre Haute, Indiana plant. And then they ended up making DVDs, audio discs, and so forth. And the last one on the right there is RCA's Bloomington, Indiana plant. The only major city I've mentioned in this series is Indianapolis. The rest of them are college towns or small American towns. And so after the small, bigger on the East Coast moved in and repurposed the works, they were, as Jefferson Cowie in his book Capital Move suggests, they were looking for cheap labor, and they quite consciously sought women to work in their Midwestern plants. So the photo here on the left is of the Farnsworth television factory in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Philo T. Farnsworth, credited with the invention of the television. And so his Farnsworth factories in Fort Wayne depicted there. And then on the right there is a woman working at the RCA radio and television plant in Bloomington, Indiana. So I think there's a really interesting gendered component to this aspect of the regional and rural that we maybe sometimes miss, that's worth sort of thinking about. Just finishing up here, and then I would love to have a conversation with you about some of this. Both the town of Richmond, Indiana, and nearby towns, maybe the capital city of Indiana, Indianapolis, have rediscovered Jeanette in different sorts of ways. It's been quite fascinating to watch from just my first trip in the 2000s to now. It's really been a huge transformation. So this image of Hoagie Carmichael here on the left is and from downtown Richmond, Indiana. This old logo is from the remaining industrial works in Richmond. This building here on the lower right is part of that complex. It's become a kind of a park and a kind of a shrine to Jeanette. They have these this sort of Jeanette Walk of Fame where people who have recorded there, from Gene Autry to Louis Armstrong to King Oliver and others, are commemorated there. So it's been really fascinating to see. And then just as the pandemic started in earnest here in the United States, the Indian Historical Society built a recreation of the Jeanette recording studio, and their recreation is in Indianapolis. And there's an actor essentially that reenacts what a recording session would have been like at Jeanette in 1927. So this was a almost completely unknown label until the last decade or two, and the transformation has really been sort of amazing in terms of how it's really gone. I want to thank you for listening. I'm just sort of leaving you with a few questions. The notion that music production is not, what counts as a music city or not a music city, and that music production is happening given sound recording's low barrier to entry. It's happening all over, and so maybe our history should be broader in that sort of extent. Which cities get to be associated with music, with movies, with books, with the internet, with radio, with television, and with media? Um, as a product of this part of the United States, I myself have had to reassess my own relationship with where I'm from, to think about it in new ways. I've been troubled to the extent to which I sort of internalize some of the self-deprecating aspects of people from this part of the world. And I've maybe overcompensated in the other direction now. But I'm interested in what questions you might have and what you might have to say. That was a lot in a short amount of time, but I hope it was useful. Thank you.
All right. I think we're back on. There's been a few technical glitches this morning, so I apologize to everyone. Any questions for Kyle? Had one come up in the chat. I think one
I
of the
see
things,
Sybil's question.
yeah, that's the one I was going to mention, which is of interest to me as well.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, it's obviously around the KKK, and then they sign an African American artist along with many. So were they aware of each other's links with the record label at that time?
Yeah, so it's a great question, Sybil. Thank you. And it's really hard to track this, right? There's some great discographers and folks have been working on three, and we can see from the recording cards, like they kept recording dates and information, and we could see, within a day or two, within very close proximity, you'd have African American artists, and then you would have sort of these sort of clan groups or clan sympathizers in the studio. Um, I would be surprised if they were aware of one another, probably just in the way that society was segregated in the period, including Richmond, Indiana. It wasn't in the Jim Crow South, but frankly, I think in a lot of ways the North wasn't all that much better than what was occurring in the South. Um, the historical record is really tough to follow here. In fact, one of the researchers, there was a sound recording engineer that was interviewed later in life, and he said that he had never been a member of the Ku Klux Klan, and he in fact had quit Jeanette when he'd heard that they had recorded the Klan, and then later records were found that actually showed that he indeed was a member of the Klan, at least for a time. It's so hard to know when you start to think about motive and like and involvement in that sort of thing. It's hard to parse out, but it's troubling nonetheless. And it's even more confusing. It's my understanding that the Jeanette family were Catholic, and so the Klan in that period would have been vehemently anti-Catholic. So, I don't think we certainly can't forgive Jeanette in any blanket way, but I don't think we can impugn them in any broad way because this may have been the act of a few employees. We don't really know. And so I want to be really careful here. And that's probably why I've been very careful with writing the journal article I'm working on is I really want to get it right, and it's so difficult to do.
Yep.
But yeah, it's a disturbing corner of Jeanette's history, but I think it's one we should look at. And then it's also one I think we should complicate because they're doing all this like really groundbreaking and even incredible work to represent so many cultures, right? That it's puzzling, I think, in a lot of ways that they would give voice to this other group. So
I found it interesting that they just continually were evolving their products or what their services that they're offering. So they're recording musicians, then they're moving into personal voice recordings. Then all of a sudden they're doing sound effects for film and for radio stations. I mean, was that just part of was there someone at the head of the company who was innovative in that way?
Yeah, so the company was run by several brothers, the Jeanette brothers, the father, and then the Jeanette brothers, and there was a falling out later, as often happens in family businesses. But I think they were a creative bunch, and that they knew that they had to hustle if they were going to compete with the larger companies. So initially, the first few years, they really tried to just sort of all these emergent labels in the Great Lakes Midwest were all trying to sort of mimic what the East Coast labels were doing. In fact, most of them, and I didn't mention this, but Jeanette had a recording studio in Manhattan and then later one in Long Island. Uh, the Paramount label, its parent company was called New York Recording Laboratories, although it's not clear that they ever actually had a much of a New York operation. But the sense was that if you were in the record business, you had to be on the East Coast. And then, like, slowly they realized that they could just do it out in the so-called hinterlands. But it took them a while to figure that out. And so once they did, they were looking for niches. And, we talk about, let's see, jazz. They got into country music later, different sorts of music. It was also provisional. They didn't know if it would sell for a week, 2 weeks, a month. They were just trying everything, and then whatever worked, they would repeat until it stopped working. They were occasionally aware that they were creating something of art and lasting importance, but a lot of what they were doing was about business and about doing all that.
Th-
So,
There's one other
um,
question,
and again, a lot of the
again.
stuff I'm indebted to collectors.
Um, there's one other
Oh, just saying
question.
that I'm indebted to collectors. I'm indebted to local historical societies and things. So, go ahead.
Just one other question. And again, it's something that I found interesting, sort of researching TV. But this idea of the technological issues and the challenges that they had, particularly between them, Columbia, and Victor. And someone wanted to just know a bit more about that.
Yeah, so like this can get, really technical, but basically there were two ways of recording, sort of manufacturing discs in there. One way was sort of called lateral recording, and this is where the sort of needle tracks in a more of a horizontal way. And there was another approach called vertical, or what is known as hill and dale recording, and this is more of a sort of a vertical kind of, the needle would move along in this sort of, this sort of way. And so all the two biggest companies, Columbia and Victor, had a joint kind of format agreement, that used this lateral recording, and that meant if you bought a Victrola, which most people owned, you could only play Victor or Columbia records. But so Jeanette couldn't do that. All the other labels couldn't do that, and so it was a real risk they took to sort of muscle their way in and start making these lateral recordings. But there's people that really get off into this subject. But I mean, one thing I want to point out is everything new is old again, right? This notion that format battles, technological beefs, looking for niches. In a lot of ways, streaming now reminds me a bit of radio's impacts a century ago. I mean, it really, you start to see patterns in media's transformations over time, I think. Um, and I like the recording industry example so much because it allows, the low barrier to entry means that there are new record labels starting up across Australia and across the United States all the time, right? Digital labels and cassette labels or whatever it is. The barrier to entry is such that it's always possible for people in the not in the centers to make this sort of media and to distribute it with some ease.
Just going to check if there's any more questions. Someone's put about the women working in manufacturing, and they wanted to know a little bit more about that and that fascinating photo that you had from the Farnsworth factory.
Yeah, I think there is a promotional video that I didn't have time to show, but I think it's worth tracking down. I believe it may be on the Library of Congress site. You can also maybe find it on YouTube, but it's an RCA promotional video that essentially sort of appeals to the women of the Midwest, women of Indiana, to come and work at RCA, right? And sort of make all these new friends, at the RCA plant. And I mean, Jefferson Cowie has written this book called Capital Moves, and he talks about, RCA's strategies around labor from its Camden plant in New Jersey through its location in Indiana all the way till it's operating out of Ciudad Juarez in across the border in Mexico. Really in search of cheap labor, but I think there's not been enough work done on the way in which gender was an aspect to that, particularly in media industries, and much earlier than I think we realize. And so that's something worth following up. Another thing I should say in general, and if you're doing record history research, I implore you to help, because there were many women involved in the early record industry, but almost none of them identified themselves as anything more than sort of secretaries, even though they were maybe helping out with songwriting, helping out with recording sessions, maybe even functioning as engineers. And so mapping their contributions is quite difficult. I mean, we're almost down to the level of contacting families and hoping for genealogical information, to sort of get a sense of who these women were and what they did. So that's an ongoing issue, I think, that also tied to gender. So
Thanks, Kyle. I think we've covered most of the questions. I want to thank you. I know coming from the US, we'd love to obviously have you here, but we're in a very different world at the moment. Um,
yes, that's
so
right. I have to assume, I have to assume, I expect to show up in Brisbane and there'll be like a go-betweens statue, or I'm thinking all the amazing, bands from Australia, and I hope to make it someday. I have quite a list of places to go. I do thank you. I thank everyone. So
thanks, Kyle. Um, we are going to have a 15, well, probably a bit more than a 15-minute break. We're wrapping this one up a little bit earlier. So at 10:45, we're going to move back to concurrent sessions, and then we'll come back at 1 o'clock after a longer lunch break for another guest speaker. So thank you, everyone, and thanks
oh,
again to Kyle.
Mark,
Oh,
can I say one more thing?
sure.
I would encourage any and all of you to contact me just to chat. I'd love to hear what you're working on. And if I can help in any way, let me know. So my information's there on the slide. So thank you very much. Have a great rest of your conference.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.